In the early 1990s, as the Soviet Union crumbled into dust, chaos swept across Russia like a wave no one could control. The empire that had once struck fear into the West was now a land of empty shelves, unpaid wages, and lost identities. Institutions collapsed almost overnight. The police didn't get their salaries, soldiers were left aimless, and government officials didn't know who to report to anymore. Into this power vacuum stepped a force that had been simmering in the background for decades: the Russian underworld, ready to transform itself into a new kind of empire, the Bratva. Before the fall, criminal networks in the Soviet Union had been brutal but mostly underground. They lived in prisons, in the shadows, tied together by a strict code among thieves. These men called themselves Vori v Zakone, or thieves-in-law, and they operated like a secret society. They didn't care much for political power or the outside world. Their loyalty was to their criminal brotherhood, a world governed by tattoos, hierarchy, and old-school Russian codes of conduct. But when the Soviet Union collapsed, these thieves saw an opportunity they had never had before. As the new Russia tried to figure out what democracy and capitalism meant, assets that had belonged to the state were suddenly up for grabs. Everything was for sale: factories, mines, oil fields, banks. But there were no rules, no regulations, and no one watching. It was the Wild West, Russian style. The smartest and most ruthless criminals realized they didn't have to keep working in the shadows anymore. They could step into the daylight, form companies, bribe politicians, and build empires. They called themselves businessmen, but they were really gangsters with lawyers. Many of them came from prison backgrounds or had ties to former KGB and military units. These were men who knew how to keep secrets, intimidate rivals, and organize people like a military operation. They used force when necessary, but more importantly, they used fear. They began extorting the new class of Russian entrepreneurs who had sprung up during privatization. If a man had a small factory or a retail store, someone from the Bratva would show up and offer protection. Refusing wasn't an option. In many cases, they didn't even need to ask. Just the reputation of a gang was enough to make people hand over a cut of their business. At the center of this growing criminal empire were figures who quickly became legends. Men like Semyon Mogilevich, a man the FBI would later describe as one of the most dangerous criminals in the world. Mogilevich wasn't just another thug. He was smart, calculated, and fluent in multiple languages. He built bridges between different gangs, between Eastern Europe and the West, and between criminals and politicians. Others, like Vyacheslav Ivankov, known as Yaponchik, took the Bratva's muscle straight to America. He moved into New York, set up operations in Brighton Beach, and began importing Russian-style racketeering into the American underworld. Back in Russia, the violence was staggering. Contract killings became a daily occurrence. If a businessman refused to pay up, he wouldn't last long. Car bombs, drive-by shootings, and assassinations in broad daylight were part of everyday life in cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg. Journalists who tried to report on these killings often ended up dead themselves. Police were either on the payroll or too scared to investigate. Judges were bribed or threatened. It wasn't just criminal gangs fighting among themselves. It was a war for control over the new Russian economy, and the Bratva was winning. Their operations grew quickly. They controlled the drug trade, human trafficking, and arms smuggling. They took over parts of the oil and aluminum industries. They opened banks and used them to launder money through fake loans and shell companies. Some even bought seats in parliament or worked closely with politicians who needed muscle or cash. The lines between government, business, and crime began to blur in ways that made it nearly impossible to tell who was legit and who wasn't. By the mid-1990s, it was clear that the Bratva wasn't just another gang. It was a national network, loosely connected but coordinated when needed. Each city had its own leaders, but they knew each other, respected a kind of unspoken hierarchy, and kept the peace when it served everyone's interest. At the bottom were the street-level thugs, extortionists, pickpockets, and drug dealers. Above them were the enforcers, the ones who carried out the hits and handled the violence. Then there were the fixers, the lawyers, accountants, and insiders who made the dirty money look clean. At the top were the bosses, many of whom never got their hands dirty at all. They wore suits, lived in mansions, and traveled the world. What made the Bratva unique was how quickly they adapted. When the government started cracking down on obvious criminal behavior, they shifted gears. They used banks to move money. They bought real estate overseas. They created companies in Cyprus, Israel, and the Caribbean. They invested in casinos, nightclubs, and even movie studios. The money they stole from the ruins of the Soviet Union was laundered, invested, and multiplied until it looks like it came from legitimate business. But behind the fancy paperwork and designer clothes was the same old code of silence, loyalty, and violence. In Russia's prisons, the old Vori culture still lived on, but it had to evolve too. Some of the newer criminals didn't follow the old rules. They were more interested in money than tradition. They didn't care about honor among thieves. They wanted power and weren't afraid to kill other Vori to get it. This led to conflicts inside the Bratva world, with some trying to hold on to the old ways and others embracing a more modern, corporate form of organized crime. It wasn't just about stealing anymore. It was about building a system where crime and business were the same thing. By the end of the 1990s, the Bratva had become more than just a criminal group. It was a shadow state, a network that reached into every corner of Russian life, from politics to business to culture. They had money, power, and protection. The police couldn't stop them. The government didn't want to. And the people, many of whom were just trying to survive in the chaos of the post-Soviet era, didn't have the means to fight back. To many Russians, the Bratva was just part of the new normal. As the 1990s gave way to a new millennium, the Russian Mafia didn't slow down. It evolved. The borders of Russia may have remained the same, but the Bratva's reach stretched far beyond them. What began as a scramble for control in the post-Soviet collapse turned into a well-oiled international machine. From Western Europe to the United States, the fingerprints of Russian organized crime were everywhere. On stolen passports, on forged documents, on cocaine shipments docked in Rotterdam, and in the fake shell companies registered in London, Miami, and Tel Aviv. In the early years of expansion, the Bratva used immigration waves to set up shop abroad. Large numbers of Russians, Jews, Ukrainians, and other ex-Soviet citizens had fled the economic disaster back home and started new lives in cities like New York, Berlin, and Tel Aviv. Hidden among them were gangsters. They blended into immigrant neighborhoods, speaking the language, playing the part, and building connections. Brighton Beach in Brooklyn became a stronghold. Some called it Little Odessa, but the Mafia treated it more like a satellite office. From there, they launched operations across the East Coast, laundering money through restaurants, nightclubs, and car dealerships. Russian mobsters didn't come into America trying to take over the Italian Mafia's turf, at least not at first. They had a different playbook. They used lawyers and accountants, paid in cash and silence. They bought up real estate through cutouts and used legitimate business fronts to hide criminal revenue. Bribery and intimidation were their tools of choice. If someone needed to be dealt with more directly, they brought in contract killers from abroad, men who didn't speak English and didn't leave fingerprints. The FBI and other law enforcement agencies were slow to catch on. The Russians didn't wear flashy suits or shoot up the streets like in the movies. They were quiet, efficient, and incredibly hard to trace. Their organizations didn't follow a strict top-down structure like the American mob. Instead, they operated in loose cells, connected by family, prison ties, or mutual business interests. This made it difficult for law enforcement to take down an entire group at once. Arresting one member didn't necessarily expose the rest. By the mid-2000s, their influence had reached across Europe in a big way. In Germany, the Bratva ran smuggling routes through the Baltic states. In Spain, they infiltrated the real estate market and used it as a front for laundering dirty money. In Cyprus, they found banks that turned a blind eye, offering financial secrecy in exchange for huge deposits. Israeli authorities found themselves overwhelmed by a sudden spike in Russian-speaking criminals involved in everything from human trafficking to illegal arms deals. They also built alliances with other powerful criminal groups. The Bratva supplied weapons to the Balkans during the Yugoslav wars and traded narcotics with Latin American cartels. They provided muscle and security for African warlords and did business with Asian triads. Their adaptability made them the perfect partner for anyone who needed something dirty done quietly. In return, they gained access to new territories and new revenue streams. Inside Russia, the mafia's presence remained as strong as ever, though it looked different on the surface. Gone were the street fights and public shootouts. In their place came men in suits running billion-dollar companies, some of them even listed on the stock market. The Bratva learned how to play the corporate game. They bought influence through campaign donations and built ties with politicians and military officials. The system didn't fight the mafia, it became the mafia. Judges, police officers, and bureaucrats were either paid off or too scared to stand in the way. During this time, Vladimir Putin rose to power. A former KGB officer from St. Petersburg, Putin knew the criminal underworld better than most world leaders. He had grown up surrounded by the rough reality of Soviet-era street life and had worked in a system that blurred the lines between espionage and criminality. Under his leadership, many oligarchs and criminal bosses made peace with the state. If they supported the Kremlin, they were protected. If they didn't, they were pushed aside, or worse. This created a kind of unofficial pact between organized crime and the Russian government. The Bratva operated with relative freedom as long as they didn't interfere with state priorities. In return, they were often useful tools for exerting Russian influence abroad. When money needed to be moved discreetly, when someone had to be silenced, when a political opponent needed to be embarrassed, there were always men available who didn't need instructions spelled out. Back in the West, the Bratva continued to evolve. Cybercrime became a new frontier. Russian hackers, often trained in elite schools or former state institutions, teamed up with gangsters to pull off massive scams. They hit banks with phishing attacks, stole credit card data in bulk, and ran ransomware operations that locked up entire corporations. The money flowed in by the millions. It was low risk, high reward, and nearly impossible to trace back to anyone of real importance. And just like in the old days, the profits were laundered through layers of shell companies, hidden behind fake identities and tucked away in offshore accounts. In the luxury streets of London's Mayfair, Russian money poured into mansions, high-end shops, and elite private schools. Some of that money came from legal sources. Much of it did not. But the British financial system, like many others, didn't ask too many questions. In Monaco, in Switzerland, in the south of France, the same pattern repeated. Bratva money bought influence, access, and respectability. They moved in circles where no one dared ask where the money came from. Despite their efforts to stay in the background, violence was never far away. Contract killings in Vienna, Prague, and Berlin shocked locals, but rarely resulted in convictions. Witnesses disappeared, evidence went missing, and when arrests were made, the defendants were often acquitted or deported before any real prosecution took place. The reach of the Bratva extended into the courts and law enforcement agencies of many nations. They didn't just bribe, they intimidated. They didn't just threaten lives, they threatened families. Even with all this power, the Bratva still had internal struggles. Factions rose and fell. Some leaders grew too ambitious and were eliminated. Others got greedy or sloppy and ended up dead or in prison. But the machine itself kept running. New recruits were always available. Young men looking for a way out of poverty, willing to do anything for money, loyalty, or the promise of power. The Bratva trained them, tested them, and used them. By the time the world began to truly recognize how far Russian organized crime had spread, it was already too late. Their networks were deeply embedded into global finance, politics, and business. They didn't need to carry guns on the street anymore. They had lawyers in New York, bankers in London, brokers in Hong Kong, and developers in Dubai. The Bratva had stopped being just a mafia. It had become something far more dangerous, a global criminal empire that knew how to play by the rules while breaking every one of them behind the scenes. In the early 2000s, the Russian Mafia began to look less like a street gang and more like a global corporation. The men who once smuggled vodka and ran rackets in back alleys were now moving through the corridors of luxury hotels, stock exchanges, and government buildings. Some had traded prison tattoos for tailored suits. Others still carried knives beneath those suits. But the game had changed. The Bratva wasn't just trafficking arms or laundering money anymore. They were becoming silent partners in multi-million-dollar business deals. And they were doing it across multiple continents. By this point, the structure of Russian organized crime had morphed into something fluid but powerful. There were no formal titles, no corporate chains of command. Leadership came through reputation, control, and deep personal networks. A boss in Moscow might not directly order a hit in Prague, but his name alone would be enough to make it happen. These men didn't need to show up in person. They had intermediaries, enforcers, bankers, and political allies who did the heavy lifting. This decentralized but loyal structure made them almost impossible to dismantle. Arresting one member meant nothing if 10 more stood ready to fill the gap. They had also grown more sophisticated in how they handled money. Banks in Latvia, Estonia, and Cyprus became key players in laundering billions. Fake businesses moved funds through layers of accounts, bouncing them from one country to another until the origin was buried under paperwork. Russian oligarchs and gang bosses used identical tactics. In fact, many times they were the same people. A man might appear on the cover of Forbes one month and be named in an Interpol file the next. The line between legitimate business and criminal activity was intentionally blurred. One of the Bratva's most valuable tactics was forging alliances with people in power. These weren't always obvious. They didn't need to own politicians, just rent them for a while. A police chief might be paid to look the other way. A customs official might ignore certain shipments. A judge might delay a hearing until key witnesses vanished. In countries with weaker institutions or high corruption, the mafia didn't just survive, they thrived. Places like Moldova, Ukraine, and parts of the Balkans became ideal operational hubs. But even Western countries with stronger systems found themselves infiltrated. Money has a way of buying silence, no matter the flag on the wall. The Bratva also began investing in media, tech, and infrastructure. Buying a newspaper or a television station gave them both influence and cover. They could shape narratives, bury stories, or smear enemies. In the digital age, they hired tech experts to run disinformation campaigns, crash servers, or manipulate online polls. Sometimes it wasn't about profit, it was about power. Controlling the story meant controlling perception, which could protect their real operations from too much attention. Cybercrime became a core part of their business. The Bratva saw the internet not just as a tool, but as a battlefield. They ran phishing operations that stole millions. They targeted hospitals, corporations, and even government systems with ransomware, demanding payment in cryptocurrency. The anonymity of the digital world fit perfectly with their style. It was hard to trace, fast-moving, and global. Their hackers didn't need to speak the same language as their enforcers or bankers. They just needed a target, a plan, and time. Behind the screens and keyboards, the old-school violence never disappeared. People still got killed. When a banker got too curious, he fell from a balcony. When a journalist published something too accurate, she was found dead in her car. When a rival gang tried to muscle into a profitable market, they were buried in forests outside of town. These weren't random acts, they were statements. Quiet warnings to anyone who thought about getting in the way. At the same time, the Bratva was taking on a more polished image. They sponsored charities, attended public events, and shook hands with CEOs. Some even posed as legitimate investors in failing Western companies, offering badly needed cash in exchange for equity and silence. They understood the Western appetite for fast capital, and they used it to insert themselves into places no one expected. You might see their money behind a tech startup, a mining project, or even a soccer club. Meanwhile, within Russia, things were changing. The Kremlin had tightened its grip, and only those in favor with the ruling elite could survive. Some older criminal bosses disappeared, literally and politically. Those who remained learned to work with the state, or at least stay out of its way. There was an unspoken rule: as long as you didn't challenge the power of the Kremlin or embarrass the country, you could do what you liked. That meant the Bratva began to look more like a service provider than a rogue element. Need a favor, a threat, a pile of cash moved overnight? They could handle it. Quietly, efficiently, and for the right price. This alliance was especially visible during conflicts like the annexation of Crimea or the wars in eastern Ukraine. While official Russian forces operated in the open, private contractors, smugglers, and criminal networks played a support role, moving weapons, providing logistics, or gathering intelligence. It became harder and harder to tell where state action ended and criminal enterprise began. They bled into each other, reinforcing one another's reach. By now, the Bratva wasn't one group, but many. Dozens of factions operated under the same loose umbrella. Some were ultra-violent, clinging to old traditions of street power. Others were sleek, white-collar operations, run like hedge funds with criminal backing. Some specialized in cybercrime, others in arms trafficking or narcotics. They rarely fought each other unless business interests clashed. In most cases, they preferred to divide the world like a pie and stick to their slice. To the outside world, they remained a mystery. Law enforcement agencies around the globe launched task forces, opened investigations, and froze bank accounts. But the Bratva adapted faster than the system could respond. They built new networks, opened new fronts, and kept one step ahead. A crackdown in one country just pushed them further into another. And since they didn't wear uniforms or sign contracts, it was hard to prove anything in court. Many of the most powerful figures behind the Bratva have never been arrested, let alone convicted. Even when names surfaced, bankers, lawyers, real estate moguls, it was often years after the damage had been done. By then, the money had moved, the documents were burned, and the witnesses had gone quiet. The Bratva wasn't interested in fame. They wanted results. And they were very good at getting them. What made them so dangerous wasn't just the crimes they committed, but the way they shaped the world around them. They didn't just steal money, they reshaped economies. They didn't just kill people. They sent messages that shifted politics. They weren't content to survive in the shadows. They had become part of the system itself, embedded like a virus in the machinery of modern life. And they were just getting started. In today's world, the Bratva isn't as loud as it used to be, but that doesn't mean it's any less dangerous. If anything, it's become more refined, more careful, and more deeply embedded in global systems than ever before. The tattoos, the street fights, and the brash shootouts that once defined its image have faded into the background. What remains is something far more elusive, a quiet, powerful network that works behind the scenes, shaping events without ever needing to appear on the front page. Modern Bratva operations are less about local extortion and more about global reach. Their money moves through cryptocurrencies, encrypted messaging apps, and private networks that leave no trace. They work through layers of intermediaries, using fake passports, shell companies, and offshore trusts. A single operation might involve players from 5 different countries, none of whom know each other by real name. The goal is always the same: move the product, clean the money, and make sure no one can follow the trail back to the source. But when it comes to violence, the old rules still apply. The Bratva remains one of the most efficient users of contract killings in the world. Whether it's a journalist who got too close to a money laundering story, a banker who threatened to talk, or a rival who crossed a line, the result is the same. It's never messy, it's never public, and it rarely leads to arrests. These hits are often carried out by trained professionals, brought in from outside, and vanished before anyone even knows what happened. The message is always clear: no one is untouchable, and silence is safer than justice. Kidnapping has also become part of their toolkit again, especially in parts of Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and even select areas in the Middle East. High-value targets, businessmen, heirs, even foreign nationals, are sometimes abducted, not for ransom in the traditional sense, but as leverage in business deals, extortion plots, or as punishment for crossing the wrong line. These operations are carefully planned, often assisted by corrupt local law enforcement, and rarely reported in the media. In recent years, the Bratva's influence has become more intertwined with political movements and global instability. In countries where chaos reigns, be it from war, corruption, or economic collapse, they find opportunity. They don't need to control a government to benefit from it. All they need is access, protection, and the ability to operate in the gray zones where no one else dares to go. That's why they've been spotted in places like Syria, Libya, and parts of Africa. Places where conventional business doesn't exist, but the demand for weapons, fuel, and black market connections is higher than ever. At the same time, they continue to wield influence in the Western world. They bankroll elite properties in London and Manhattan. They invest in companies, influence markets, and push money into political campaigns using backdoor methods. Sometimes, the people they fund don't even realize who the real source is. The Bratva isn't just trying to stay ahead of the law anymore. They're trying to shape the systems that write the law. Despite decades of investigations, the Russian Mafia has proven itself nearly impossible to destroy. Law enforcement agencies from the US, the UK, Germany, Israel, and beyond have poured millions into tracking their movements. But the core of the organization remains intact. Every time a high-ranking figure is arrested, another quietly steps in. Every time a shell company is exposed, 5 more appear somewhere else. Their strength lies in their flexibility, their ability to adapt, and their refusal to rely on any single person or place. For ordinary people, the Bratva might not seem like an immediate threat. They don't see the faces behind the financial fraud or the hands pulling strings in a foreign conflict. But the damage is there, in rising housing prices driven by dirty money, in fake pharmaceutical shipments, in ransomware attacks that paralyze hospitals, and in the quiet deaths no one investigates. The Bratva doesn't need to make headlines. Its power is in remaining invisible. And in the modern world, invisibility is the greatest weapon of all. From the alleys of Moscow to the boardrooms of Manhattan, the Bratva's reach has never stopped growing. Their names may not appear in the headlines, but their influence lives in politics, finance, war, and every shadowy deal in between. As law enforcement plays catch-up, the Russian Mafia continues to evolve. Smarter, quieter, deadlier. What began as a brotherhood behind bars is now a global force few dare to challenge. For more stories that reveal what really goes on behind the curtain, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon. There's always more lurking beneath the surface.